Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University, Benny Green, the one-man band, and Nicholas Tucker, lecturer in psychology at Sussex University. We have music from our old friends Instant Sunshine. Oh, jokes about muesli last week, you may remember. Some of us thought it was woven on special looms, but B.W. Thomas of Ashburton writes to say there's nothing new in all that. How could we have forgotten the great Beachcombers campaign to get people to knit their own bowler hats from wholemeal spaghetti? How indeed, Benny, could we have missed that one? And Miss M. Flower of Bude tells me that Surgeon Captain Peter Cleave, Royal Navy, was known as Bran Man. He shipped muesli aboard in sackfuls to give them, in his own words, bowel movements as smooth as the guns they fired. That's very nice to know. I felt particularly sorry for David Gower when they stopped him being captain of the English cricket team, because he doesn't look any older than I was when I was detailed off to be captain of the Merton Bushy Junior Mixed Second 11 football team. This was the first and last time I was ever chosen to fill a position of power and responsibility, and I suspect it was a direct consequence, such are the vagaries of these appointments, of coming first in the slow bicycle race on open day. My 10-year-old heart nearly burst with joy at the suddenness, the absolute unexpectedness of the preferment. The only trouble was I didn't know what a captain was supposed to do. So at half-time, I called a conference in the middle of the field. I was careful to sit on the ball. I must have read about someone like Harry Wharton doing a thing like that, and I cried in a soaring treble, "We must all run very fast and kick the ball very hard." "Aye, aye, sir," squeaked my 10 spindly-legged toadies, and we continued to run about in all directions, bumping into each other, till the final whistle signalled a goalless draw. Now, that's all I remember about being a captain, not knowing what you did. And looking at David Gower's innocent face, I think that aspect of it may have troubled him too. As for the rest of you, I dare say captain's the lowest rank you've ever held. Being a captain, and of course there are all sorts, wouldn't bother any of you, I'll bet.
It's because of the slipperiness of the word that nobody does quite know what to do. I mean, in the army it can refer to a definite rank. Used in infant school and junior school it means nothing very much at all, and is simply a way of delegating authority. I mean, even more nebulous, I don't think even 5-year-old kids fall for it when they're made vice captain. I don't think anyone ever believed in being a vice captain. So therefore, whenever the word captain is used, it immediately raises questions about psychological characteristics of the person who's taking the job, because that's the only thing that, in a way, that you can ask about. The only way I can think of defining a captain is someone who has to discipline someone else in the thing, and therefore it relies on the presence of someone who is ill-disciplined. And without both them in the team who is ill-disciplined, then really you don't quite know what you've got a captain for.
How do you do it, do you see? I mean, if you're trying... I didn't know anything about doing it, but if someone is doing it wrong, all you can say is, you really shouldn't do that, you must do it right. You can't take them to the Old Bailey.
In the whole discussion of Gower's captaincy, the thing was about what particular psychological qualities did he give forth? And there was a notion almost like saintliness, really. Almost like saintliness. It infects the rest of the team in some magical way.
It's Scotch mist.
I think we got on a wrong track. Bob's confession, he didn't know what to do as a football captain, is quite true, because a football captain doesn't do anything. The whole point about being a football captain is it has no duties and it has no real power. The point about a cricket captain, and Gower is one example among many, is he has great power and great responsibility, because he decides the tactics and the strategy of the team, decides whether they bat or bowl, decides who bowls, whether it's fast or slow, whether they go for the runs or play for a draw.
It only takes about 5 minutes.
No, well, not with the rules as complex as they are today, Bob. I don't even know how they work out the one-day rules, for instance, when they're playing. It must be, you need a computer. But all that is a real responsibility. Apart from disciplining, you can't discipline grown men, of course, it's absurd. But a football captain has no duties at all and very little power. All he has, I suppose, is a kind
I'm
of
very relieved after all these years to hear that.
Bob, yeah, you weren't defaulting,
I had no reason
Bob.
to be bewildered.
No,
it was just
there are no
everyone felt
duties.
that.
There are no
that's
duties.
good.
I think, Benny, that's, I'm afraid, too simple. Because the captain isn't just the sum of the people behind him. He's got this extra quality that somehow is taken to represent the whole side. And I remember one of Arthur Marshall's descriptions when he was at prep school and a little boy captain opened the innings and was bowled first ball and then burst into hysterical tears. And somehow the fact that their captain had cried in front of all the others made it much worse.
Dreadful.
And I think, the English football captain, however small his tactical manoeuvres on the field may be, if he was actually picked up drunk in Mexico, there would be much more objections if it happened to the fullback or someone like that.
No, I don't think drunk. I mean, there was a drunken captain of Nottinghamshire many years ago and was called up for the committee because he appeared at the ground drunk, but he'd scored a century, and his defence was, I think you'd better give a bottle to all the other guys in the team. It doesn't really matter.
Yes, there was a sort of idea when I was at school that people who were rebels or semi-delinquent were made captains because all that energy, all that dross would then magically become pure gold, and they would be very charismatic and heroic and something brigandly about a captain. But I remember it as I was games captain for my sins, and I distinctly remember
That's what captains always say.
Yeah.
For my sins.
They
yes,
do,
yes.
see,
You
they
said
do.
that without thinking.
I did.
didn't you?
You're
Yes,
right.
yes, yes.
Absolutely. Exactly. And the worst thing about it that I recollect was not really being able to tell. The games mistress told people what to do.
Yes.
What I had to do was look after the visiting team at tea time. It was down to me to sort of make sure they were having a nice time and show them around the school, which was an absolute nightmare. But there does seem to be an idea that people's style of captaincy, that's the phrase they use, they say his style of captaincy. What on earth does that mean?
I wonder what's he up to? It makes it sound like dancing.
I want to pursue the idea, really, there isn't such a thing as a captain, really, that they don't... I mean, if you think of something like captains of industry, you rather wonder how on earth anyone becomes a captain of industry. Does someone ring you up and say, by the way, good news, you're a captain of industry? No, of course they don't, really.
I mean, I'm sick of being a lieutenant of industry.
That's right, yes, I mean, we want two captains. No,
but think what an insult if someone called you a corporal of industry. Wouldn't that be just terrible?
Captains, when you get on a plane and there is someone called a captain and he says, hello, this is your captain, and he says it over the intercom, I never believe it for a moment.
I do.
It sounds to me like an honorary title he's decided to give himself.
I'm always relieved when he says that. I'm always relieved, I'll hire on, I'll take his shilling, he is my captain, because he'll keep me safe, I always feel. A lot of people feel demeaned by being told that he's their captain.
If there are only two people there and he says, I'm the captain, I always feel there aren't enough people to be captain of.
Well, the point is, Laurie, there are very few people who are willing actually to say, I am the captain, because I think it's become a very hot seat. I remember in the D-Day celebrations in 1945, I was all caught up in a crowd in London who was milling around, and suddenly this military voice barked out, will everybody please stay still? And I looked round, and there was an absolute captain, with a peak cap, and I thought, here is a man that we're all looking for. But of course, everybody stayed still, and then nothing happened, so we all started moving again. And then I thought that you like these people when they hear these voices in emergency. The trouble is you hear them at other times when, as a 9-year-old, they'd say to me, get your hair cut. And then, of course, you resented this particular authority, and I think that's the difficulty with being a captain. But you've got to succeed, but you've also got to be one of the lads as well.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the captain in the crowd actually had a peak cap, because most captains, when they had the New York blackout, everyone turned into a captain and started directing the traffic, and you can't do that in a blackout. It's not very handy. But some people some people continue to wear the uniform to which they were once entitled on the inside a long time after they stopped being entitled. I distinguish here between a captain who was once a captain of a boat, because it really takes a bit of looking after a boat, but a captain who was in the army and was only in charge of people keeping their hats on straight only deserves to be played, as indeed he was, by Arthur Lowe. Benny?
Am I right or wrong in assuming that when you get confidence stricters and people that pose, they always choose the rank of captain?
Absolutely.
Now,
Splendid.
Captain Grimes.
Well, Captain Grimes, I'm thinking of Captain Fowler now.
Oh, yes.
And Captain Boycott. I know he was a real captain, but he was pretty much of a mess. and it's Captain O'Shea and Captain Hook, for instance. I know, what is he a real captain?
Hook was in charge of the boat, wasn't he?
He'd been to Eton, too.
He's real.
This is further confirmation of the fact that there aren't any real captains left now. It may have been necessary
yes,
to be a
there
captain
are.
of a
You
ship.
only
I
have
mean,
to
look in
travel
America, how with you have bell captains and you have sky captains. You know, I mean, people who carry your luggage are called captains or caps, so that the word captains becomes... Nowadays, there is no need for ships and aeroplanes to be controlled by people called captains. I'm quite certain they are technologically managed, and the appearance of a man with a peaked hat on is merely to reassure children like Bob who have infantile fantasies of being looked after.
What about
I wouldn't worry too much about it. I mean, but Sarah...
To come back to the captains in the army, the point about a captain is it's a fairly low. It's just about one of the lowest ranks.
It's better than
so they were
lieutenant.
young, yes, but only one, just better.
It's the
And
third rank up.
The image that it conjures up is of the young captain. The picture I have in sort of World War I, going over the top before his men. Now, the whole point about a captain is that he's one of the lads as well as being a leader. This is why the term non-playing captain is absolute rubbish. That is a manager.
A captain is often one of the dogs. Yes. Because I remember the first captain I ever met was my grandmother's dog, and in those days it seemed to me every single dog was called captain, and it was a dark sort of dog, and my Uncle Bill used to bring home a Saturday treat for him, which was an Eccles cake bought at a shop called Unwin's just round the corner. But human perfidy being what it is, Bill had put the thing on a plate, and as often as not one of the family would eat the Eccles cake before captain ever got near it. And once my uncle summoned them all into the kitchen in front of the dog and gave the dog the Eccles cake, didn't give it to him, just made him lick it and put it on a shelf, and so ever afterwards they didn't know what to do. But when I hear the word captain, I have to admit, the first thing I see is a dog about as dark as my grandmother's kettle.
I think the definitive captain, because he appeared on the cover of the Boy's Own paper type thing last century called The Captain. This was somebody very out of the ordinary. It's a boy, nonchalantly, that's the only adjective, hands in pockets. He's got a silk scarf round his neck. In the background, about 30 shadowy figures all waving their caps in the air and saying hooray. And that is your captain. It's the boy who's somehow much better than all the other boys. It may have been something that could only exist in Victorian England. So it may be that our problems with captain is it's basically a 19th century conception which doesn't really fit into the 20th century world.
Well, what you say may be confirmed by the recent cavortings of the England football team, because we were told that without Brian Robson as a captain, there would be no inspiration in the side, etc., etc., etc. He played 2 games in which there was no inspiration in the side anyway, and the minute they left him out, they won a match. Don't blame Brian Robson for the two bad performances, but it does question the whole concept of a team of grown men inspired by a captain. Maybe schoolboys are.
Well, what about the mythical?
Nicholas is now agreeing with me. We are gradually getting a little group over here who don't believe the word captain exists anymore in the modern world. And I tell you one further thing. Racing tipsters like Captain Heath.
And Captain Coe.
Yes, Captain Spyglass is the best one.
I mean, if they're racing tipsters, they said, when along came Ted Heath and called it... I mean, anybody who's got a boat with 3 people on elects somebody called a captain. It's meaningless.
No, Captain Spyglass. And also, captain was very much associated with the circus. The lion tamers were always called captain something. And J.B. Priestley, I was taking a little home movie in his garden once, and he felt you had to act up for a home movie, because, of course, you can't hear the words, so he sort of mimed things. And he put one arm round his wife, one arm round mine, and the words he spoke, I know, but you can't quite lip-read them on the silent film, was Captain Priestley and his 2-trained sea lion. And that's an honourable descent. But the mythical captains are the ones you remember, like, what, the Flying Dutchman? There must be captains galore. Captains Courageous,
Captain's Courageous. And there was a film when I was a teenager called Captain from Castile. And he was supposed to be...
Errol Flynn, I'll bet.
And Captain Blood. Errol Flynn was Captain Blood. Raphael Sabatini. And he was a dashing captain. Captain Hornblower was another one, but because they made him an admiral in the end and rather spoiled it.
Yes. But don't you think that the most famous captain in the last 10 years, though, has been Captain Mannering? And
yes.
It seems to me that he absolutely illustrates the problems of being captain, that he's ridiculous, he's fussy, and yet in a way he is public-spirited, that you do feel a little bit for him trying to hold the line, as well as sort of seeing, what a fundamentally flawed person he is.
Yeah, but you're quite wrong to say captains don't exist. You only have to travel on an ocean liner to see the potency of a captain, who women will kill each other to get to the cocktail parties.
The only captain I believe in was someone, I'm trying to keep on, I seem to be dragging Liverpool into this, was the captain of the scouse boats at Paddy's Market. Now, Paddy's Market, I don't know whether Laurie, he won't remember, but he will have heard of it. It was a sort of specifically Liverpool dimension. It was a sort of a market. And the captain of the scouse boats was the man who would wheel in a sort of yoke or cart with 2 swinging bins full to the brim with scouse. Though whether it was blind scouse or lob scouse is something, this was another uncle of mine told me all this, it was something you could never rely on. And somehow in would come this creature of myth, and the stall holders would cry, "He's off the port!" And then he'd start coming in, he'd start ladling, the captain of the scouse boats would ladle out the stuff, and then another cry, a murmur would go up. "Blind as a newborn kitten, be Jesus." That is only, you probably don't know, lobscouse has got meat in it, and blind scouse, it follows, has not. And so it was. But that's the only one that I really believe in.
Captain of the ferry boats. You remember, there was a joke in Liverpool. They would say, "Oh, he's at sea." And they said, "Is he at sea? He's a captain of the ferry boats." And Ron Wycherley, who was the most famous captain of the ferry boats, turned into the pop singer Billy Fury. He changed his name. He did, yes. And he on one of his curriculum vitae, or whatever you called it, it's actually said he'd been a sea captain. It turned out he was on the Woodside Ferry to Birkenhead.
I knew we'd get you out of this argument you were trying to invent if we'd pressed on long enough.
What is that story about the Jewish businessman that makes good, makes a fortune and buys himself a yacht and has a resplendent captain's uniform made with a lot of braid on the cap and a lot of braid on the arm, and he goes home to show his mother, who's very proud of him. She says, "What are you dressed like that for?" He says, "Mother, I'm a captain." And she looks him over and she said, "Well, by me you're a captain, by you you're a captain, but tell me, by a captain are you a captain?"
Oh, Milton, thou shouldst be living at this hour. If you hadn't told that, I would have done, because Milton always does. And, it comes up fresh as a daisy any time you like. Do you remember the Mark Twain story in which a man is transporting a number of ripe cheeses in a coffin, and he goes into the railway carriage and puts it on the roof, and there's only one other person in the carriage and he thinks it's a corpse, and a corpse is getting a bit high, and he's very respectful, he begins by, as it were, referring to him as a captain, or taking the captain to his long home, he says, but as he got higher and higher, the smell of the cheeses, so the ranks increased, and he got him through, major, colonel, he ended up as general, as though really, this is really the point that I'm getting at, that a mere captain was just sort of mousetrap cheddar, where a general was entitled to the full nasal panoply of a rich gorgonzola. Upon that note, in default of a better, we embark on Wings of Song. Instant Sunshine will sing My Kind of Street.
The streets of Paris breathe perfume from each pore. Ancient buildings line the streets of Rome. New York streets have so much to explore, but the streets of central London are my home. The streets of London are the streets I love, with garbage underfoot and pigeons up above, chasing flying litter as it ducks and weaves, kicking up the rubbish like the autumn leaves. I long for London's grime again, no matter where I roam. There's nothing like the litter on the streets back home. The city now doth like a garment wear, the mantle of the morning lying there. Tickets, paper, cardboard cups, old boxes, soggy chips, fag ends, broken bottles, paper sacks and ragged tips. City class, where there's muck, there's brass. The streets of Paris smell rancid and decayed. Crumbling buildings line the streets of Rome. New York streets help muggers ply their trade, but the streets of central London are my home. The streets of London that I know so well, they may be paved with gold, but nobody can tell. The road sweep is redundant, he's hung up his broom. Garbage clogs the gutters and the trash heaps loom, as Fleet Street papers flutter by St. Paul's beneath the dome. There's nothing like the litter on the streets back home. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching or a stench so high. Last night's evening papers torn, discarded coloured mags, sad half-eaten Chinese takeaway in plastic bags. London's pride, where the blue bottles glide. The streets of Paris have drains that rodents dread. Masonry clogs up the streets of Rome. New York streets are littered with the dead, but those grubby streets of London call me home.
Well, they weren't singing that for nothing, were they? All about streets and such. They must have heard, as indeed we all have, that Bond Street celebrated its umpteenth anniversary the other day. 300th, I think it was. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. And once again, I found I was getting Bond Street mixed up with Quality Street, because it's one of those streets that look as though they're unpacked every morning, so that people wearing their best clothes will have somewhere to walk about in. But people are prejudiced about streets. I remember a taxi driver suddenly saying, "If there's one street I can't stand, it's Lily Road, Fulham. I've only to pass the end of it and my heart sinks." And then after a bit he said, "But tooting Broadway, that's another matter." Well, it's a bit of a mystery. I think I took against Bond Street because I was 20 before it occurred to me how it screwed on to the rest of the universe in the shape of other streets like Regent and Oxford and even Piccadilly. I knew they were all round about, but I couldn't have directed anyone. I thought of streets as ends in themselves rather than routes to anywhere else. And so I associate Bond Street with my own inexpertness, but Chancery Lane, which I only knew as a bus stop you walked up to Gamages from, used to seize my infant heart, and I had a vague idea I should almost certainly want to live there when I grew up. Do you collect streets?
Yes, and they're also there. Streets are an urban thing, specifically. Urban and sometimes in villages, but they are not suburban. The minute you get into the suburbs and respectability, you get closes, ways, parades and avenues, but streets go. And the street has an air of sort of raffish danger, doesn't it? And it's on the up at the moment. Streets generally are on the up. We talk about street culture and streetwise, and or some of us do. I mean,
no,
those
none
of us who don't know any better. No,
Sarah,
exactly.
that's right.
Exactly. No, I don't.
I accept your inverted commas.
And I am not. I don't use those terms. But the fact is that they are a strictly sort of urban thing, and the idea of being streetwise is the impression that you can cope with the shark-infested waters out there, but also somehow that it's homely. I'm sure this accounts for the attraction of soap operas like EastEnders and of course, Coronation Street. But it's a whole environment, not just a road which cars go down.
Absolutely.
On the whole, I think that's where novelists are different from life. That in a novel, you pore over the name of the road in which your characters live because you know that people are going to sort of see all sorts of novelist-type meanings into it, whether people live at Bleak House or Wimpole Street or things like that. In real life, you sometimes get roads which have the wrong name, like Paradise Row in the East End, which is a very dingy road, which is really mocked by such a pretty name. And then there's quite a nice road in Eastbourne, near where I live.
There's no nice road in Eastbourne. There's no nice road anywhere.
It's called Waterworks Lane, and it's got the it's got the wrong name.
Yes, it has.
I can remember going well, not quite as far as Eastbourne, but going back up to Liverpool and remembering in the first association of names, there's always that little area round Seaforth called the Poets. And it was just no Poets, and for a long time I never had any idea. People just say, "Do you come from the Poets?" I'm from the Poets. And the Poets, of course, were roads which were called, there was a Burns Road,
yes.
a Burton, there was Longfellow and a Keats, and there was Shelley, and they all sort of like networked together. And I often later on used to go with far too much literary self-consciousness and wonder or not whether the length of the streets or the shape of the streets or the, perhaps, whether or not they referred to the rhythm and the metre, perhaps, of the chosen poet.
Well, in the East End in the old days when it was the dockland, a lot of the streets were named after the places that the ships of the local lines went to. So you had Pekin Street and Canton Street, and if you went there to look at them, very disappointing. But what is interesting to me are the streets which become symbols for a whole part of life. For instance, Carey Street as bankruptcy, and Threadneedle Street for the bank. And the one I love, I think a piece of English genius, is he's in Queer Street.
Yes.
And Queer Street evokes a whole picture of a strange place where everything's falling down and you can't get out of it.
Yes.
I'd like to know who invented that.
Yeah, it's very good.
Civvy Street, isn't there? An Easy Street, and Skid Row.
Civvy Street and Easy Street, beautiful.
And
yeah.
also, just to go back to sort of local things that I can think of, there were a lot of Roman roads in the part of the country where I come from, and surely Roman roads are roads in the true sense of the word. I mean, they were great long, as the crow flies, jobs for yomping along in your tunic and open-toe sandals. And in fact, both of these roads are called streets. One is called Ermine Street and the other is called Icknield Way, both of which sound like little sort of suburban paradises with pampas grass, don't they? It's ridiculous, and yet these travel sort of miles and miles.
Watling Street is
Watling Street also.
one as well.
But
it's funny that they're called that.
You're talking about the names being wrong for streets. I thought my Palmerston Road was the only one. I had no idea. I thought it was the only Palmerston Road in the world when I was a little boy living in a Yorkshire town, as I did briefly. And I didn't think streets were named so much as christened, and that the roads became the name. It didn't matter what you called the road anymore. It mattered whether you called, he was christened Laurie or you christened Benny. You became that. And when I heard, or when it sort of was borne in upon me, and I was instructed that there isn't a town in the kingdom that doesn't have a Palmerston Road, I thought to myself, with all these doppelgangers going about, where's identity in all this?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that when that particular thing happens. But what I like about streets is that, I mean, in many ways they just illustrate the class system. And when Hancock was made to live in railway cuttings, that was sort of an ironic reflection upon his lack of status. But sometimes you suddenly get a book written or a horrible murder committed, and a whole street, which was riding high, will actually descend. So, for example, Rillington Place has now actually had to have another name. And I remember when the Profumo thing was on, I don't know, but when the Profumo thing was on, a lot of people who were very happy in their maisonettes in Mandy Place all suddenly said, it's time for a change of name. And I'm rather glad, because otherwise it's just sheer class, isn't it?
Yeah.
There was an anecdote I read. I was always puzzled by the fact that there's a Euston Square station, but there isn't a Euston Square. Until I came across by fluke an anecdote in the memoirs of Ford Maddox Ford, who said when he was a boy he had violin lessons from a man who lived in Euston Square. And one day in the house, a bloody murder was committed. And the police came, and it was all over the placards, and it was a big scandal. And the citizens who had lived in the square demanded its name be changed because of the adverse publicity. And it became Ensley Place to this very day, which explains the mystery why there's no Euston Square. But the Palmerston thing, Bob, I once did some research. I got an A to Z street guide of London to find out who was the most honoured person in having streets and roads named after them. And there was one person who was miles in. I mean, there were a lot of Wellingtons and there were a few Dickens and one or two. But there was one person who was miles and miles. I wonder if anybody can guess who it was. It's quite obvious in a way.
Queen Victoria.
Queen Victoria, over 100 in London alone.
Yeah.
They were streets, roads, terraces, avenues, closes, places. Over 100 Victorias.
I suppose the idea that the argument that we've been putting about the association between streets and their names, it falls down so much in New York, where you've simply got numbers, and any number has shown itself capable of acquiring magic. I mean, you want to talk about 42nd Street, you've got to talk about Fifth Avenue, or even if you get out and talk about Route 66 or anything like that, all of a sudden mere numbers can do it. But it is...
Songs have done it, Laurie.
Yes, but songs have done it, and musicals have done it, but also there is still the particular glamour. I mean, if we talk about New York and all those streets and the magic of mathematically working out, which avenue crosses at what particular point, but there, the magic of Broadway... The eccentricity of Broadway is so magnificent there. I mean, that is one street which goes diagonally across, which refuses to do its north-south or its east-west, and goes streaking across from the Bowery right up to the other end. And that strangeness about it, whenever you're on it, you feel that you're running against the whole current of the city, because
I'm sure Benny's right, not only songs, but I mean song and story. I mean, Broadway, as we know, is a disagreeable, fly-blown thoroughfare.
Yes.
But it's like Eccles Street out of Ulysses, or Mountjoy Square, or any of the names out of Ulysses. It has a secondary existence due to the power of the imagination of the songwriters, or in the latter case, of Joyce himself. But it's something to do, I think it appeals to us, both the Dublin things and the New York things, because we are, in a sense, exiles, just as Joyce was. We go there, we visit there, but it's a mysterious land to us. And in a curious way, with Joyce, who lived away from it, that increased the power of the actual place. When you go there, it lives in two places, both in the book Ulysses and also in Dublin. But what about the songs? There must be a lot of...
George M. Cohan is responsible solely for Broadway, because he was the one that glamorised it and called it the Great White Way, and wrote Only 45 Minutes from Broadway and Give My Regards to Broadway in great socko success musicals, and it became established that Broadway was a glamorous place, so much so they put a statue up to him in Times Square, which is there to this day. If it hadn't have been for Cohan, Broadway would have been seen, as you say, Robert, as a fly-blown dump, which it is.
But take a name which you can't do anything about. Take Sauchiehall Street. Now, whenever you hear the name of that, you think that Glasgow can't do anything about that. I mean, you see Harry Lauder and people like Harry Lauder jumping around, and if Glasgow's image is going to be changed by all these advertisements on the sides of the buses, you really do feel something's got to be done about the name, because that suggests the primitive image of Glaswegian drinking more than any other name.
It's funny, I think that's a very poetic name.
Sauchiehall Street.
Sauchiehall, I can hear people falling over.
It would fit in a song very well.
I know we aren't such good songwriters as Americans. I wish we were, but
we used to be.
Berkeley Square will always be different to me just because of that nightingale. Not that I
can I disillusion you? It isn't an English phrase.
A nightingale sang in
No,
Berkeley
apparently
Square?
not. It was stolen by the songwriter from a short story called A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square by Michael Arlen, who was an Armenian.
He was more
he's
English
the
than
green
the
hat.
English, though,
Yeah.
Michael
An
Allen.
English Armenian.
Yeah,
I
and
think
he wore a coat with a fur collar, and he used to say his family motto was Paragio ad Astrakhan. I'm sorry about that.
Talking of families, my favourite family of streets lives in Soho, where there is a Dean and Frith and Greek. They always seem to me like sons, relations of Old Compton Street, and there is Old Compton running alongside with his three rightly racy boys, Dean, Frith and Greek.
Yeah, that's a perfect example of streets that are, quote, going down, or at least in my estimation they are. That if you want an image of the fly blown, simply step across the boundaries of civilised life into Soho. But I betray my prejudice there. What about streets that are coming up? I'm not going to name the streets because it would only cause offence.
Might
to
help
those who
property
live there.
values.
They've been coming up for 30 years, to my knowledge, and they haven't arrived at wherever coming up is going to. And I conclude that it's a chronic state. Coming up is a way that you live with, that you're always coming up, these streets are.
Not actually, just to disappoint you completely apropos of what you were saying, but the high street in our village is called Hay Street, which can lay you open to the most
I
awful
bet
charges,
it is.
either
That's
of
how the posh
exactly,
say it.
I bet
either of
it
being
is.
satirical, you know,
I
or
must
of,
say that, you know, Dickens,
suffering from a fit of gentility when people ask you the way.
Dickens, when he went away to Genoa, I think he was writing Bleak House, he wrote a letter home saying that I can last for 2 weeks in this place without the streets. And then he said, my imagination collapses. I need the streets like food and drink.
I tread upon your heels there. My favourite streets are in Dickens, and there's a little opening couple of paragraphs describing Lant Street in the Borough, and the description's so vivid I sometimes think I must have lodged there along with Bob Sawyer myself and forgotten about it. And it simply goes like this: there is a repose about Lant Street in the Borough which sheds a gentle melancholy upon the soul. There are always a good many houses to let in the street. It's a by-street as well, and its dullness is soothing. A house in Lant Street would not come within the denomination of a first-rate residence in the strict acceptance of the term, but it is a most desirable spot nevertheless. If a man wished to abstract himself from the world, to remove himself from within the reach of temptation, to place himself beyond the possibility of any inducement to look out of the window, we should recommend him by all means to go to Lant Street. In this happy retreat are colonised a few clear starchers, a sprinkling of journeyman bookbinders, 1 or 2 prison agents for the insolvent court, several small housekeepers who are employed in the docks, a handful of mantua makers, and a seasoning of jobbing tailors. The majority of the inhabitants either direct their energies to the letting of furnished apartments or devote themselves to the healthful and invigorating pursuit of mangling. The chief features in the still life of the street are green shutters, lodging bills, brass door plates and bell handles. The principal specimens of animated nature, the potboy, the muffin youth and the baked potato man. The population is migratory, usually disappearing on the verge of quarter day and generally by night. His Majesty's revenues are seldom collected in this happy valley. The rents are dubious, and the water communication is very frequently cut off.
Sarah Harrison, Nicholas Tucker, Benny Green and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Instant Sunshine provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.